Welcome back to the shop, my friends. Steve here at SKS Hobby Workshop, and yes, I am working on part 2 as a follow-up to my giant Trench Crusade game board, but I've also been working on a recipe to make my terrain and my 3D prints look like concrete or stone, and I think I've done it. This is just XPS foam. These are 3D prints right off the build plate. No sanding, no additional hand painting, and this is the type of color and texture that I'm getting with this method. So if you're interested in making your terrain or 3D prints look like concrete or stone with minimal effort, I want to show you how to do it. Let's go ahead and get started. First things first, I need to print off the model on my Bamboo X1 carbon. This bunker file is from Diceverse over on My Mini Factory. I assembled the front gate using some Bob Smith superglue with a little bit of accelerator. The top plate can then be attached, and I like the fact that this is removable for gameplay. The cross comes in 2 halves, and then it can be attached to the top of the spire. Now I'm making at least 2 bunkers, one for the Christians and one for the heretics. The heretic version, the spire is going to be broken, so I need to cut it down. To fill the gaps on the infill, I'm using some 2-part epoxy sculpt. Once the 2 halves are mixed together, they can be applied and then sculpted with various sculpting tools and smoothed out with water. Now, like I had mentioned, I'm not going to sand the print before adding the mixture, but I do want to go in and fill the gaps to at least make it look seamless. So I'm going to roll out some thin tubes of epoxy sculpt and then press those into place. Switching over to a dampened silicone tip tool, I can move the epoxy sculpt around and better match the surface textures. The 2 bunkers can then be left to cure. With the epoxy cured, I can now attach the spires to the top. Now there is a decent gap all the way around, and to fill this I'm going to use the trick of baking soda and superglue. Once these 2 elements have been combined, it creates a chemical reaction. The baking soda turns into a cement and becomes very hard. Any excess can then be brushed away, leaving just the hardened powder. And if you need to, pin files can be used to sand the baking soda down. The spire for the other bunker can then be attached to the top, and the process can be repeated. Now I could have also filled this gap with additional epoxy sculpt, but in case you didn't know about it, I wanted to share this technique with you as well. Now it's time to make our stone/concrete facade. I'm going to start off with some Maipe beige unsanded grout, but with a little bit of very fine sand added. Now grout has been used in dioramas for a very long time, but not on 3D prints because it usually rubs off, but I figured out a solution to that. To this I'm going to add some of my 3:1 distilled water to PVA glue mixture, along with a little bit of distilled water. Using a slightly larger cup, I'm going to add more of the powdered grout, and to this I'm going to pour in some but not all of our mixture. By keeping these separate, it allows me to control the consistency of the grout. Now the key to getting this to stick to the print is spraying on some Rust-Oleum self-etching primer. This will prep the surface and give our mixture something to hold on to. And here you can see how the consistency is similar to a watery oatmeal. Before the mixture is applied to the surface, I paint on some of the PVA and distilled water mix. Then using my brush, I dab on the grout mixture as my first coat. After the side had been covered, I'll then take some dry grout and sift it on top. The powder was then heavily sprayed with a mixture of distilled water and isopropyl alcohol. The ratio of that being 3 parts water to 1 part iso. After the area had been thoroughly soaked, I'll then use a foam brush, pressing any of the dry powder into the moisture. I'll then continue to work my way around the outside of the bunker until the entire surface had been coated. Because the top is removable, I'll also paint the interior. Now while you're painting on the PVA mixture and the grout mixture, you'll notice that the bristles on your brush will start to flare. That's just an excess accumulation of sand and grout near the ferrule. So make sure to have a small container to the side that you can continually rinse your brush out in. Before I forget, one thing to note is that grout can contain silica, so make sure you're wearing gloves and a respirator. Now with areas that are more vertical, you may need to change the consistency of the grout mixture. You can do this by adding additional dry powders into your mixing cup. But if the consistency is good, just keep working your way around the piece. Now the cool thing about Grout is that it does come in a variety of different colors, so you could easily change the entire look of a piece depending on what colors you want to use. To help speed along the dry times, I use a hair dryer on high, and you can see how it lightens up the material quite a bit. And this is just after one layer. I'm already starting to get some really cool textures. Now if you need to, a second layer can be applied on top. In this case, without covering the entire surface, I went back to certain areas that just appeared to be a little too light. Using some 400 grit sandpaper, I went ahead and knocked down some of the heavier grains, but as an added bonus, this also helps edge highlight. And here you can see with just a little bit of sanding how much it changes the look of the piece. I also wanted to try this technique on a model that was much more detailed. So I printed off this ruined piece from Malediction, once again priming it with some self-etching primer. Just like before, the first layer is going to be a mixture of distilled water to PVA at a 3:1 ratio. This time around I make my Grout slurry a little bit thinner. That way my hope is that it won't obscure as many of the details. After the first thin layer is applied, I go ahead and use my hair dryer to lock that in. And it's already looking pretty good, but I'm going to add one more thin layer. Of course, the other way to do this would just be to add one thin layer and then add paint on top. After the second layer had been applied, I once again use my hair dryer to speed up that dry time. 400 grit sandpaper is once again used to knock down any large granules of grout or sand. And I tell you what, for a super fast application on some random terrain, the overall look of these pieces is absolutely fantastic for wargaming. The insulation foam is a similar process, but after the battle damage is applied, I can't use self-etching primer because it will eat the foam. So I paint on a watered down layer of Liquitex Heavy Body Mars Black. After the paint had been allowed to dry, I then applied the PVA and distilled water mixture to the surface. The dried grout was then sifted onto the glue. The powder was then heavily sprayed with a mixture of distilled water and isopropyl alcohol. A foam brush can then be used to make sure that all of the dry powder is saturated. To give some variation to the surface, after using the foam brush, I then dab the surface with a damp paper towel. Before the grout had a chance to fully cure, I went back in and re-scribed all of my panel lines. Now at this point, the grout will still absorb liquids, so you could easily apply washes of acrylics or inks to tint the surface. That's what I'm going to do for my final look, and I'll cover that process more in the Trench Crusade Part 2 video. So hopefully you enjoyed this mini tutorial and you're able to utilize this method to make your own terrain and 3D prints look like concrete or stone. And if you are using any of my tips or tricks, feel free to tag me at SKS Hobby Workshop because I'd love to see your creations.